Welcome back to our fourth episode of NAS's podcast on equity, diversity, and inclusion within school psychology. I am Shayla Desai, the NAS Director of Educational Practice. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm honored to be the host of this series. This episode will focus on professional issues and specifically on navigating the field of school psychology as a person from a minoritized background. Today, I'm joined by guests Yadi Diaz and Janice Parker, who will be sharing some of their experiences and challenges as school psychology practitioners. To start, could both of you tell us a bit about how you came to choose school psychology and what your current role is? Let's start with Yadi.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me today. Before getting started, I'd like to honorably mention and give thanks to the ancestry on whose land I currently stand on. The Chicago area is located on ancestral lands of tribes such as the Council of the Three Fires, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, Kickapoo, and Illinois nations. I also want to acknowledge my own ancestral indigenous Durango ties to the lands of the Tepehuanes, in which the Tepehuan and the Tarahumara resisted and continued to resist in colonization. So that's something that's undeniably a part of my identity and what's influenced my theoretical framework in the way that I approach any work that I do. And I feel that's really shaped my experiences in school. Just being a first generation college student, I was someone whose first language was not English. So experiencing that in schools and how that kind of shaped my self-esteem and my identity and my experiences with institutions has been really pivotal. And I started my career as being a teacher and then noticing that I wanted to have a bigger impact at a systems-wide level, but also the psychology aspect of how people form their identity and how they view themselves. I think both of those kind of compelled me to make the switch to school psychology. So that's kind of been my trajectory.
Thanks so much for that. Janice, how about you?
Yes, and I'm going to try to condense my trajectory and what got me here and make it very short and sweet. But in terms of school psychology, I think like many people in the field, I kind of just stumbled upon it. I always knew that I wanted to work with kids and adolescents, and in particular, to support Black kids and adolescents. Giving some of my early childhood experiences and just experiences in general in being a Black individual and a Black woman in particular in America. And so I always, tell people for the first half of my childhood, we grew up in a small town in the panhandle of Florida. So just put that in context, right? But in the particular neighborhood, the first half we grew up in, it was, very much so low income, lots of drug and gang activity. And as you can imagine, the elementary school my sister and I attended was underfunded and the resources were not there. Moving forward, when my mom got her degree, we climbed up the economic ladder. We moved to quote unquote the other side of the tracks, went to a different elementary school that was well funded. And you can only imagine the stark differences that I saw. And so those experiences have always resonated with me because it reminded me of the struggles of, Black America, in particular Black kids, and how so much of that is embedded in education and what we do and don't do for those individuals. So when it got time for me to choose a graduate program, I was looking at clinical psychology, counseling psychology, social work, all of the above. I stumbled upon school psychology. And again, mentally, I went back to that critical moment in my life where I realized that when done well, and when we address, the systemic issues, education really can be a way to grant students of color access to a variety of goods and services. And so that's the short answer of how I got to school psychology, really just being a part of the liberation of Black people in America.
Thank you. So as I said in the intro, this episode is going to focus on navigating school psychology as a person from a minoritized background. And you've spoken about this a bit already, but I'm curious to hear more about your identities, including areas of intersectionality, and anything else you might feel comfortable sharing, because I want to hear throughout this episode about some of your individual experiences, as well as what your perceptions are about some of the common challenges that are faced by others who might share identity with you. So Yadi, if you want to start.
Sure. So, the reason why I really went into education was, again, to be a part of an institution that touches a lot of people's lives. So for me, because I had limited experience in terms of different professions, education just was something that was really natural. It was something that I was familiar with, and it was something that I knew the majority of our population had to go through that system. So I feel like that's where there was a lot of potential to make the biggest impact. For me, as a student of color, particularly as a Chicana student who was in the English language track, there were a lot of things that I was starting to internalize about myself, about my community, that was really stemmed in the educational system. So I was noticing a lot of differences between what I was learning about myself, my history, and my identity from my family, and from my community. And it was very different from what I was learning in the school setting. And I began to resist at a very early age. I'm a firstborn, I'm very outspoken. And I come from a history of females who tend to be very strong and outspoken. So I started speaking out in school. I had the opportunity to not only attend schools in the Midwest, but also in the West Coast. So just seeing the different dynamics, both in elementary and then in high school, I had a lot of shifts. You got to see just the differences in the way that people express themselves in a school setting. And what I started to notice was in my resistance, there was a lot of oppression. So that to me was very, in a sense, traumatic. And I think it continues to be that way in my professional setting, but in a different way. So me knowing that experience is not something that I was content with, or I felt that should be happening, that kind of led me into the segue of schools in general. I didn't know necessarily exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to be a part of that to change that. I kind of found my way. I started in elementary education, was in the classrooms, and then I made my switch into Latino studies, and then teaching at the high school level. That experience was very interesting to me because I did end up in a school setting that was very affluent and not very diverse. So that experience, I was trying to resist by showing a different side to the population that was dominating the system. But through that, I think I found a lot of challenges in terms of, is this how I should be resisting? Is there a better way? And then also noticing that I was being categorized to work with a very specific population. And through that, trying to have like the AP track, like how can we capitalize on this cultural wealth, this language wealth, and finding that in that resistance, there was a lot of battle. And then also noticing how easy it was for people to have conversations around the discrepancy and the deficits and the pipeline into special education. So that's kind of how I found, I've always had an interest in identity and psychology, and then coming across the school psychologist and kind of having those conversations. And I want to give Janice some time to speak to, so we can kind of bounce off of what that experience was like then, being a person of color at the graduate level. And then now in my profession, coming back to the institution, but as in the role of a school psychologist, I think is much different, and you see things more clearly.
Yeah, so it sounds like your identities really kind of shaped your trajectory. And I wanted to go back to one piece of my question around if there's anything else about your identity that you wanted to share with us in areas of intersectionality other than what you've described so far.
Yeah, I think just being a woman, I think the label of, I feel like there's a lot of intersection even with the Latino community and the term Latinx. And, that also subscribes to that notion of colonization. So trying to resist that label. We are natives of the America. And I think that there's so many layers even within that the more I learn, the more rooted and the more confident I am in my identity, I feel like the less I'm able to label it. So that is something that, I try to bring at the forefront in terms of psychology and identity and how we represent ourselves in the field.
Thank you. So yeah, Janice, I'd love to hear more about your identities, anything, again, that you're comfortable sharing. And as Yadi got into thinking then about how those identities have shaped your experiences.
Yeah. So I would say core aspects of my identity, a Black woman, and obviously for me, a woman of faith, and that does shape my identities and actually the work that I do. I would say those are the three pivotal parts of my identity. And if I had to talk about, geographic location and region, growing up in the Deep South really has shaped a lot of my perceptions as well in terms of America and schools and education and so forth. And so I think one of the biggest things, when I think about the first three, right? So being a woman of color, living in the Deep South or growing up in the Deep South. And again, the first part of my life where we were considered, low SES. So my mom has always socialized us, and by us, I mean my sister and myself, to be prepared, right? To be prepared for racism, to be prepared for people who will question your competence, who will make you feel like you're less than because of our skin color, because we're Black, and also because of, our womanness, right? So that's something that continues to resonate with me, where I'm constantly doing kind of a self-check and also reminding myself of the greatness, right? And when messaging tells us otherwise, that also, again, it approaches the way that I approach my work as a faculty, as a researcher, because so much of my work is grounded in the strengths of the Black community in particular. And then I would say, as a byproduct, similarly, racial and ethnic minoritized individuals. And I say that because despite, being grown up in a single parent home, despite, being low SES and so forth, we had a lot of community-based strengths that surrounded us, that I know in my heart of hearts helped us to get to where we are, helped me to get to where I am, considering all of those different identities that are there. And I think a lot of times in education and in school psychology, we're constantly talking about the deficits, what Black kids can't do, what are all these things against them, right? Which is, of course, so important to consider from a systemic standpoint. But we miss the collective strength that comes with being Black in America, and where that collective strength comes from. That's why I also highlight, for me, being a woman of faith, my church community growing up and even now rallied around my family, my mom, gave us what we needed, the tools, the resources, the motivation, telling us that we can do it and so forth. And that helped us in many ways. And so even now, my research really looks at, religious and spiritual diversity in school psychology, and how do we honor that, especially among so many families of colors. And of course, I recognize not all, right? We're not a monolithic group, but so many families of color where that spirit right? Doesn't necessarily have to be religion, but that spiritual piece, that connection to a higher power, to nature, to our ancestors, to all of those factors. We know that that has kept us afloat for so many years, but as school psychologists, we don't talk about that part of diversity. We don't talk about how that from a mental health standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, how that has kept people of color afloat, and what do we do with that? You know, how do we sit in front of families in a school setting who may say, you know, it's my faith that's keeping me there. How do we build upon that instead of like sitting around like I've seen so many people do when I was in schools, when families would bring up their religion and we'll be like, oh my God, we can't say that. What do? We can't acknowledge it, right? There's separation of church and state, but yet it matters. So that's my long-winded answer of saying all of those identities influence who I am and the way that I operate, and also the work that I do.
No, that's really interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I agree, you know, faith is something that we don't focus on a lot when it comes to our training and practice, but you're absolutely right that it does play a significant role for a lot of folks. So I want to also hear from both of you about your sense of some of the common challenges as well as areas of positivity experienced by women of color who are in school psychology. And I want to just have a brief disclaimer that I'm not asking you to represent all women of color here in your response, just some of your perceptions and what you might know from speaking with others who have shared identities. Janice, do you want to start? I know that you've been involved not just in research, but also with school psychology sisters, which I know is a big Facebook group. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, you know, my experiences and just some of the experiences that I've heard from others. And again, I appreciate your disclaimer, right? That this is not the experience of all, but it is something to consider, right? To amplify those voices that are so often silenced. I think in short, you know, my personal experiences, but then also what I'm finding and some of the work I'm doing around early career practitioners of color and women of color, is there's a lot of racism, right? And sexism that we often experience in school settings. What I have found to be very remarkable about the work that I'm doing, and even as I reflect on my experience, we think the K through 12 education system is like this liberal system, kumbaya, everyone is all about social justice. And no, absolutely not. And when I think about my experiences and the stories that I've been previewed to through my work, but then just connections and genuine relationships with other women of color, it is hard because not only are we, you know, trying to assert ourselves, knowing the moment people look at our skin color, right? That there's these biases, these, you know, this feeling of I'm questioning your competence, right? Everything my mom prepared us for when we were little. We see it in real time. So I think that's a big challenge there. But then as a woman, something that I also found that was very remarkable when I, you know, talked to colleagues and again, my own experience is the sexism that we experience, not just again, not just from our white colleagues, but our Black male colleagues, right? And again, not making a broad sweep. I know there's differences, but that was one of the common themes that we heard in this recent work we're doing, where, you know, a few of the women of color would say it was also other men of color, right? That question our competence, that try to silence us and so forth, which is why I think, you know, that intersectional perspective from Kimberly Crenshaw and that Black, you know, feminist thought is so important because there's that double marginalization that unfortunately works against us in school settings. So that's the challenge. In terms of the strengths, I just love how we support each other. I love how it truly is a sister, right? Or sisterhood. I love how we understand each other's woes, and we create safe spaces for us to get that out. I was just listening to a podcast this morning. It was talking about how women of color, especially Black women, tend to report, feeling depressed, stressed, anxious compared to white women. And the speaker was saying, as Black women and women of color, we had to own our feelings and be honest with our feelings. And so I just love the network that we've created in school psychology, and hats off to Kiera Fulmore, right? The founder of School Psych Sisters, who's also a dear friend of mine. But I just love the collectivism that we have. There's nothing like it. And for me, it keeps me afloat to let me know that I'm not alone in this. And I have genuine people who understand it, who have my back in different ways.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yadi, what about you? What would you say are some of the common challenges and areas of positivity?
And Denise, when you were speaking, I could relate to a lot of your points. So I feel like you said it all very nicely. I think one thing that stood out to me, and this could be just my curriculum and instruction background and my teaching background, with this notion that schools are very liberal. I feel like that's not a notion that I've ever picked up on. And I think maybe in school psychology, right? Like that's where I felt like there was this disconnect and misunderstanding of school systems and how they have historically marginalized certain populations, and very intentionally. And I think too, with the pandemic, it just being in the school setting, you mentioned like it's really hard when you're in that system. There's a lot of microaggressions. There's a lot of, assumptions made about people. I almost feel like the higher up you get in your education, the harder it is for you, because the bar is set higher, there's more expectations. And even though you're meeting those expectations, it's never enough, right, in the school setting. But, I did want to kind of mention a little bit about the pandemic and how things are kind of being discussed. And I feel like it's been highlighted, and now it's more important to look at institutions because now it's impacted the white sector. So there's that like interest convergence. And that has brought in a lot of conversation around identity, representation, who's at the table, who's included. And the one voice that I feel is always like the one area that people have the hardest time with is the brown voice, right? Like who should be there, who's in that space, and are we considering all angles and all aspects? And I feel that that's not just very specific to the school setting, but in school psychology as well. But some of the positive things that I found, I'm very new to the field. I'm in my third year, the School Psych Sisters page, because I feel like the brown voice, we're kind of like trying to find our way in this, like the sense of community and understanding and the connection, like we're all coming from the same place and understanding. We have different experiences, different lived experiences, but that has been tremendous, especially as a professional in a new role, sometimes in a building where there really isn't anybody else that looks like me other than the students. And when we're having those conversations about students, it's always in a negative light. So it's just really empowering to be on that page, just to hear other people's experiences and understanding those connections. I feel like it's really good for my soul, for my heart. So I think that's been a really positive thing, and it's flourishing.
I'm so happy to hear that. I know it can be so challenging to be like the only, whether that's in your professional setting, in your graduate program, et cetera. So having that sense of community outside of the school building or outside of the university is so critical. And I'm so glad to hear that you both have had those positive experiences with community. Is there anything else that you wish the field of school psychology better understood about the experience of being a person of color in a predominantly white field? Go ahead, Janice. I think that's
so much, right? But a couple things that stands out to me. I think we have to understand that racial and ethnic minority people, we're often on the front lines fighting the fight, right? Because we don't get the luxury of, after our 8 to 5 job, turning it off, right? We don't get the luxury of, I'm there at work, but I can go home, or I'm writing about it and I can go home. No, this is our lived experiences, right? A lot of us have kids, family members, friends, and so forth. So this is our life. But because this is our life and we're so passionate about this work, in many ways, it's exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
It's exhausting. And I say it to say, this can't keep being our fight alone. We need our white colleagues to show up and step out and fight along with us, because it's so draining and it's so taxing. And I think about, this push around, social justice and, challenging the field to be advocates and to address, systemic issues. And that's so important. What I think is missing from the conversation is what that means for people of color, right? Because we're doing it. But what happens when we're doing it and we're targeted because of it? And people are in the field are not supporting us as we go home and just using, hypothetically drown in our sorrows, right? And so I just say, as we push for social justice, we have to acknowledge how draining and burdensome that it can be, even while it's inspirational, right? For people of color. And we got to stop leaving our colleagues of color out to dry by themselves, essentially. And you can finesse that when you edit it, but essentially we got to stop leaving it up to them and them alone, because it's too much of a burden to carry.
I agree with you. And not just only that, I also find, and I'll just speak to my own community, sometimes it's easy to align with white because that's been viewed as right. And it's easier, right, to avoid that resistance and to be highlighted or targeted. So there's even like conflict within, our own communities and spaces. And I feel like in some instances that can be even more problematic because it's not a unified voice, especially in a school setting when there isn't a lot of representation. So I think that that's something that we can do as a collective whole, not just, people of color versus white, but even within our own communities and our own spaces. We need to be more intentional. And I also find that some of the reasons behind maybe why it's not as cohesive is not having awareness or education around the history, the implications, and the vocabulary around that. So I don't think it's because they don't necessarily agree with the movement. I just think they don't understand and what that could mean in the future for the kind of work that we do. So in terms of school psychology, I think it really starts with the education and the training around the work that we do. So we talk about social justice very theoretically, at least from my experience, right? I would like to see a little bit more discussion around the actual measures that we use. What's the historical implications of that? And how can we measure differently? Because I think that that's so embedded. I feel like we're pulled in two different directions and it can be really confusing. We're saying we want social justice, we want change, we want you to advocate, but here are some tools that have been historically oppressive and may not be measuring strengths and the beauty of what it is to be just an ethnic minority. So I think that there is still a long way to go, but I've seen more of that conversation, more of that intentionality around getting the right people at the table and just getting varied voices and experiences at the table. And I think that's really important to continue to do.
Yeah, I think, it's long overdue, but school psychology is entering a phase of some self-examination and thinking about both current practices as well as historical practices that were, unjust And so you guys have both spoken a bit about this already, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you think school psychology should be doing or should not be doing with the goal of advancing racial and social justice.
Something that I can think of just being a practitioner in schools. I feel like the pandemic has created a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities for change if you jump on it. And one of the things that kind of stands out to me that I feel we haven't touched on as a field of school psychology, that's such a pivotal thing that we can target, is the involvement of Pearson and testing in our schools. So using MAP testing, STAR testing, our WIATs, our WIS, like all of that, I feel like this right now I'm noticing parents are choosing to opt out of access testing, all these benchmark data that we use, right, to note student progress. Parents are opting out. And now we're being forced to use classroom data, and we're also being tasked with the challenge of diversifying our staff. So I feel like this could be a really critical moment where we can talk about curriculum, instruction, and practices in the school, in the classroom, and kind of moving away from that measurement piece. And I feel I want to hear more conversation about that. Again, I'm very new in the field, but this is something that I'm kind of like waiting for to happen. And I just haven't been in those spaces where those conversations are taking place. But I feel like school psychologists and school psychology in general could be really instrumental in leading that conversation.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, so I think we have to pay more attention to practitioners. And I will say, so 2 years ago, I joined the early career committee for NAS, which is why I'm really into like all this early career, stuff now in terms of like my research and so forth, or branching my research out. But being on that committee made me realize, for the most part, we have a good bit, of course, we could benefit from more, a good bit of research related to the experiences of graduate students, right? We have a good bit of research or different support structures in place for faculty, right? Faculty of color, graduate students of color. I feel like those resources, those conversations, those targeted conversations and support, in my experience, I'm learning that it tends to fall by the wayside when it comes to our practitioners of color, especially our early career practitioners, which is why, we're so excited. And by we, I mean my colleagues and myself, who are getting ready to embark on this journey, right, of creating the structured support program for early career women of color in school mental health fields in general, because they really are a forgotten population. Not only are they reconciling with just a general kind of transition being early career practitioners, but then you layer that on with, again, the racism, the sexism, ageism, all of the isms, right, that also make that early career transition so difficult. And so I do think as a field, we have to do a better job of making sure that those that are transitioning are supported. And I know we have different mentorship programs or opportunities, but at least in my experience, nothing that's structured, right? And so we're hoping through this work to bring light to some of the benefits of maybe having something more structured in place to make sure that we're not forgetting about a population that, in my opinion, we really have not attended to as much as we should be. And that's a part of retention too, right? Once they're out in the field, if we're not supporting them when they get there, then they can easily go to another career field. And I've heard that many times from early career practitioners of color, especially women.
Yeah, thank you. So those are all of the big questions I had for today. Are there any final thoughts that you think would be important to share with our audience?
I don't think so. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I always feel like I learn so much from hearing the stories of others. So I appreciate this. And I hope that we can just continue to do the work and be about it and not just talk about it.
I agree. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, especially being so early in my career. I've learned tremendously from just hearing Denise speak. I'm so glad that you're at the forefront of the research and getting that messaging out there. I think that's really powerful. So I appreciate you for being in the field and taking that leadership. I hope these conversations continue, that there's continued inclusion. And yeah, I just really appreciate this time.
Denise and Yadi, we very much appreciate the time you spent with us today. It has been such a pleasure to hear from both of you, and I thank you both for being so open about your respective journeys in school psychology. For everyone listening, thank you for joining and taking an interest in these critical issues. We look forward to the rest of the series and hope you'll tune in for the next episode. For more information on EDI topics and social justice, please check out the NASP website. Thank you.